Okay, so today I'm going to walk you through my predictions for the upcoming 2021 NHL season. Okay, so with this slide, I sort of went through and I gathered all the data for the matchups within each division. And as you can see from the little asterisks, the the teams in column A, so like let's say Boston, in 2018, 2019, Boston had 1.4, 1.5 points per game when they played Buffalo. And Buffalo had 0 points last season, averaged 0 points per game when they played against Boston. So that kind of, I took this into account and then multiplied everything by 8 because with 7 teams in the division and 56 games in the season, you're going to be playing each team 8 times, except for in the Canadian division because that gets complicated. But basically, these are what the standings would have turned out to be if we're looking at just the division games multiplied out to 8 games against each opponent. So I have the 2 years, 2018, 2019, and 2019, 2020, and then the 2-year average of those. So I'm just going to go through my predictions for this year. So with New Jersey, I'm getting these projection lines off of dailyfaceoff.com, by the way. So with New Jersey, I really like how they brought back Vatanen. They also brought in Murray and Johansson. I think Blackwood's going to be a great goalie going forward. And I think Hughes and Subban can also have, or Subban can have a bounce back year, and Hughes can really sort of solidify himself as an NHL player. He kind of had a rough go in his first season, but he was a rookie, so we'll give him time. But the reason I put them in 8th place this year is just they lack depth and they don't really have the star power to just compete in this really competitive East Division. And right now, Nico Hischier is not listed on those projection lines because he was injured, or at least he was when I took the screenshots of those projection lines. Also, another big problem for New Jersey is that Corey Crawford just retired. Hopefully, he has good health, just because he struggled so much these last few seasons with concussions. But unfortunately, the Devils will have to turn to Scott Wedgwood, who didn't play in the NHL last year, or he'll have to sign Howard, like Jimmy Howard, or something like that to solidify that back end. Because this season, more than ever, it's going to be really important to have 2 strong goaltenders, just because you're playing a lot of back to backs and you don't want to tire everyone out. And as you can see, they also struggled in 2018 and 2019 against the other teams in the division. They were tied or right in line with Buffalo at the bottom. So it was not very pretty. Let's see. Sorry, I made this more complicated than it had to be. All right. So with Buffalo, I really like how they didn't really lose anybody with losing Jimmy Vesey and Wayne Simmons. They didn't really lose anybody that they couldn't replace. And now they have a really solid top 6 with Taylor Hall and Jack Eichel combined, the 2 star players who've needed a star center and a star winger for each other. That'll go along great. And Victor Olofsson on that line too is going to be pretty good. Stahl and Skinner, I think rebuilding that Carolina connection will really help Skinner get back to. I don't think he'll get back to the 40 goal season that he had a couple of years ago, but it'll definitely help him play better than he did last year and at least be somewhat closer to that $9 million cap hit, the value in terms of the value that he brings to the franchise, and having Sam Reinhart on that line will also really help them. I also like bring in Cody Eakin as that third line center. Cheyenne Reeder are also great additions. They're not world beaters, but it's good enough. Rasmus Dahlin will continue to develop. Montour, Ristolainen, that it's a solid team. It's respectable, but it's just unfortunate that they're going to get beat down in this East Division because it's just stacked. Linus Allmark looked great last season. Carter Hutton kind of needs to bounce back, but there's enough here that I think they're much better than New Jersey, but I just don't know that they can compete with the other teams in the East. I think the absolute highest I could see them getting would be fifth place in this division, but that's if things kind of fall off for the other teams. And also by having a shortened season, they might do better this year because these last two seasons they've been on fire for the first 2 3 months of the season, and then they fall off around Christmas. So since this regular season is only about 3 months long, maybe that'll help them, and maybe they'll just barely hold on and have maybe a fifth place or something like that. But I can't really see them in the playoffs this year with this roster. So moving on to Pittsburgh in sixth place. I think this is the year that everything really kind of falls off. I don't think this is an overreaction just based off of how they played against Montreal or anything like that. Jari played great this season, but he's going to have to play a lot more and more often because of all the back-to-back games. And 33 game, he only played 33 games out of 82 last year. So let's see. He only played 33 games out of the 82 games last year. And, he's going to have to step up because he is the defined starter now that Murray's gone. I think they lost a lot. It's just a lot of players with Marlowe and Bukestad and Sherry and Simone and Johnson, even though they weren't, and Schultz, even though they weren't, lighting the world on fire, they're still very solid players. And also, if you look at the way they've played against the other teams in the division, they really fell off last year. They were in sixth place last year against the other teams in the division. So I think this is the year where they kind of fall off. But then again, it's hard to root against Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin. So maybe they'll hold it together for one more year. All right. All right. In fifth place, I have the New York Islanders. I think they're really going to be missing Devon Taves and Thomas Greiss. But I think bringing in Sorokin will really help their goaltending. And they just have a great first line now that they have the whole Barzal situation handled. And Barry Trotz is just a great coach. You can never bet against him. They have some solid center depth with Pajot on the third line. Brock Nelson's also really solid. And hopefully Oliver Wahlstrom can play well. I think this is his first season or his first full season in the NHL. So that'll help them a lot too. So I think you could go either way with the Islanders and Pittsburgh for 5 and 6. Maybe even Buffalo is in that mix of the three teams. But I give them the edge over Pittsburgh, mostly just based off of Barry Trotz and the promise of Ilya Sorokin. And also just coming off of that conference, the conference final appearance this last year. I think they'll be solid, but I don't see them in the top 4. So if you can probably figure out who's making the playoffs by now. But in fourth, I have the Rangers. They didn't really lose anybody this offseason. And they have very solid goaltending with Shesterkin and Georgiev. And I think with all their rookies, Lafreniere, Miller, Lindgren, Capocacco is, with the shortened season last year, I you could look at him as a rookie too, almost. Not to mention just Panarin was on fire last year. So they've got a really solid team. And I think this is the year they make it back into the playoffs. Uh, they could easily finish anywhere in the top five, I think. But these other teams just have a little bit more depth, I think. So if we go on to third place, I have the Boston Bruins. Um, they lost two huge pieces with their captain Zdeno Chara and Torrey Krug, and also David Pastrnak will be out for the first month of the season. But they have enough depth. If you look at that third forward line with Charlie Coyle and Craig Smith, it's solid. Corrali's an underrated player on the fourth line. Um, Grizzly, Carlo, McAvoy, they've still got some big pieces. And that goaltending, assuming they don't completely fall off, Rask and Halak are easily one of the best goaltending tandems in the league. So, and they've played very well against the other teams in their division these past 2 years. I don't see them as President's Trophy contenders or even winning the division this year, but it's a very solid team, and I would be surprised if they missed the playoffs. But then again, losing that leadership in Chara and the offense from Krug, they might this might be the year that they slip, kind of like Pittsburgh, but I would not bet against them. And then in second place, I have the Capitals. I really am, it's hard to see Lundqvist go down with an injury, but losing Holtby and then, they signed Lundqvist and then he had to go out for his heart surgery. I think it'll really hurt Samsonov because he's going to really have to carry the load since it'll just be him and Craig Anderson. Now, Craig Anderson's numbers will probably improve since he's not sitting behind the Senators. The Capitals are a much better team, but he's getting older, and I think he was planning on retiring this year, if I'm not mistaken. So it might not be great in terms of goaltending behind Samsonov. Washington played well 2 years ago. This last year against the other teams in their division, they were kind of middle of the pack. I like bringing in Justin Schultz, especially with all the inter-division games. Playing against Pittsburgh 8 times with one of their former players will definitely help them. And they've got a solid top 6. I also think physically, because you're playing against the other teams 8 times, there are going to be a lot of rivalries built up, and some hatred will come in towards the other teams. And having physical players like Tom Wilson, Zdeno Chara, Alex Ovechkin, and the Capitals can really throw their weight around. And I would not be surprised if they even get first place in this division. But just because of goaltending, I had to drop them down to second. But I see them somewhere in the top 3 in this division. So obviously number 1, we have the Philadelphia Flyers. Carter Hart has really solidified himself as the starter. Brian Elliott is also doing pretty well. I really like the top 4 on that defense. I think Ghost is kind of like hated for, I don't know. He doesn't seem as bad as advertised in my mind, but I don't get to see the Flyers too much, if I'm honest. They didn't really lose a whole lot over the offseason, and I really like their top 9 forwards. And on top of that, they'll be getting Nolan Patrick back and Oscar Lindblom from cancer. Nolan Patrick with his migraine issues, I think it was, or he had some disease or something. But they'll have both of them back, or at least they're training with the team this year. So it should be pretty solid. Hopefully James Van Riemsdyk has a bounce back season. But there's just a lot to like here. Claude Giroux, Kevin Hayes, Sean Couturier, um, Travis Konechny, not to mention Provorov, Sanheim, Carter Hart. It's a very solid team, and I think they'll definitely win the division this year. And Hayes, especially, I was very yeah, I wasn't really a huge fan of his contract when it first came out last year, but he was exactly what Philadelphia needed. He pulled the team together. So I think that's a great contract in hindsight. At least for now. As it ages, it probably will look a little worse. But anyways, let's move on to the Central Division. Again, you can look through these stats against how the players or the teams line up against each other and their average points per game. But I'm going to focus on my projected standings. So in last place, I have Chicago. This is their first year really rebuilding. Their offense or their goaltending is completely depleted. Malcolm Subban as the starter is just not really a great starting position, and we don't really even know who their backup will be. Losing Brandon Saad will also hurt them. So I don't really have a whole lot of hope for Chicago this season, and especially having Jonathan Taves out indefinitely. A lot of the symptoms that he was talking about, just feeling drained and just not up to it. I mean, it could be some serious and scary issues, maybe even, uh, cancer or something like that. And hopefully it isn't, but losing Taves for an indefinite amount of time. Doc will be out for the entire regular season. Nylander's out for the entire season. And losing Saad over the offseason, and Crawford and Lehner at the trade deadline last year. It's not going to be a pretty year for Chicago, and they will definitely be right up there as one of the top teams for the lottery picks. For the Red Wings, this is the year where they kind of turn the corner in their rebuild. They're starting to build back up again. I think Mantha, Larkin, and I think it's just Mantha and Larkin who have multi-year deals. Everybody else has 1 or 2 years remaining. So Steve Yzerman can really rearrange this team this offseason. And Philip Hronek is really starting to come into his own. Danny DeKeyser and Hronek have a great connection. And DeKeyser really he started off great when he was a rookie, and then he fell off because it felt like he was trying to overcompensate for the poor defense around him. But now that he's paired with Hronek, he seems to be a better defender now. But he missed all of last year. So hopefully he comes back even stronger. Troy Stetcher and John Merrill are both just great defensively. They don't put up a whole lot of points, but if you look at the advanced stats, they're great defenders. So, Detroit won't be letting in as many goals as they did last season. Also, bring in Thomas Greiss, who kind of looks like the starter just based off of the stats. But he's a huge improvement over Jimmy Howard. Then again, basically anybody would. Jimmy Howard carried Detroit to a lot of great seasons over the years and really kind of carried them to the playoffs towards the end of their streak. But it was time to go, and I think he went like 2-22 last year. It was not pretty. But the bottom 6 of the roster on with their forwards it's okay. The top 6 has some promise. That top line, Bertuzzi, Larkin, Mantha, is one of the best lines in hockey. They just don't really get as much attention because Detroit is rebuilding. I really like Nemesnikov being signed because whenever they have injuries, Nemesnikov can fill in up and down the lineup. He's comfortable wherever. So they don't have to force somebody like Filppula or Ernie or Helm to go way up in the first two lines. Um, Kind of interested to see how Fabry works out at center. Yeah, I see him more as a winger, but I think surrounded by strong players like Bobby Ryan and Philip Zadina will definitely help him. And I've also seen Brome is pushing for a starting spot in the roster. So we'll see how that goes. Um, Mark Stahl is only here for the season, just as like a cap dump for the Rangers. So he's, as Steve Eisenman would say, he's a guy who can play. He's just kind of a body to throw out there. But the rest of the team looks pretty solid. And Jonathan Bernier was, he putting up a 907 with a 2.95 goals against average on the 2019-2020 Red Wings is really impressive. I think with the improvement defensively with Stetcher and Merrill and having DeKaiser back, he could really impress people. And, I think he'll probably get sold at the deadline, but he's a very solid goaltender that doesn't get enough credit. All right, moving on to sixth place. I have Florida. Um, I think losing Dadanoff and Hoffman and Hala will really cost them. They really only brought in like Duclair and Hornquist to replace them. So, they're solid players, but I don't think they do enough to really, push the envelope there. I think Wenberg kind of needs a second chance. Achari could be solid on the third line. Brett Connolly, maybe if he bounces back a little bit. Vinny Hinestroza kind of got dumped off from Arizona. So, it could be interesting. It'll definitely be an interesting team to watch. Um, Aaron Ekblad he doesn't get enough credit. But I think really what this season hinges on is Bobrovsky and whether or not he can bounce back and prove that he's worth his contract that he signed last year. But if he can't, it's going to be very interesting for Florida. But I definitely don't see them making the playoffs unless um, Bobrovsky just completely jumps back to like Vesna level. But then again, he kind of goes up year. He has an up year, then a down year. So he's due for an up year. So we'll see what happens, but it should be interesting. I have the Dallas Stars at fifth place in the Central Division. I really think that losing um, Tyler Sagan until April and Ben Bishop until March will really cost them. I can't see them competing with just Kudobin going out there every single night. And as solid as guys like Pavelski and Hintz and Radulov, Kuryanov, Ben, Heiskanen, Klingberg are, I really just don't see them competing at the same level that they were last season. Um, I've seen a lot of predictions where everybody kind of has them as a lock to make the playoffs. I think they can easily fall out. Just because they made the Stanley Cup final doesn't mean that they're the same team they were last year. They're missing two major pieces that carried them there, and not to mention Corey Perry really carried them through the playoffs. Um, they also really struggled offensively, uh, and just they were inconsistent last year. They got hot during the playoffs, and that's not to downgrade what they did, during the playoffs because they were great in the bubble, but they lost a lot of major pieces um, just due to injury, and they were inconsistent and just kind of got hot at the right time. Also, Jamie Benn and Alexander Radulov seem to be in decline. So we'll see where they are next season. But yeah, I don't have a whole lot of faith that they can make the playoffs. I hope they do, but I'm not terribly confident. And also, if you look, um, 2 seasons ago, they were definitely in last place by 5 whole points behind Florida, and you know significantly further behind with 14 or sorry Yeah, with 16 points behind Nashville for second to last place. So, you know, they were horrible 2 seasons ago, and you know, they weren't even in the top four or even the top five last year against the teams in the division this year. So, with that inconsistency and losing two of their biggest players, I'm not super confident that they'll make the playoffs this year. All right, number four, I've got Nashville. Now with Nashville, um, let's see. I have, they've got a great defense core. Pecorine should have a bounce back season, but he may be in terminal decline. I think adding Hala and Bobrovsky are great additions. Um, and they really focused on center depth, which a lot of people have made fun of them for. But once the injuries build up, it'll be nice to have Granlund and Cunnin and Howla and all these guys that can cut in and play in the center. That gives them more depth that will help them survive throughout the season because injuries will build up, especially when you're playing, back to back, like multiple times a week. And I really think UC Saros really solidified his spot as the starter last season. So overall, very solid showing. I give them the edge over Dallas just based off of the depth and the defense. Although Dallas also has a solid defense, but yeah, I think Duchesne and Johansson can really kind of come back this season. Um, they might be able to reverse that decline that they've been on for the last few years and maybe do a little bit better. As you can see, they were in the top four last year against the teams they're playing against. So, they could make some noise. All right, number three, I've got Columbus. They were by far in first place, 6 whole points ahead of Florida. Um, I think missing Nyquist until April will really cost them. That's why I only have them at third. And defensively, they lost Murray, Nudavara. Nudavara wasn't as big of a loss. And they gained Koivu, which gives them some more depth on the middle, but with center. But I think they really won that trade with Montreal, Domi for Anderson. Domi's a great player, but I just don't think it was going to work out in Montreal. And but the big storyline here is Pierre-Luc Dubois being unhappy with Columbus and whether or not he'll stay. I've seen a lot of trade rumors. Some of them have had Dubois for Mantha or Dubois for Sean Monahan. If they could snag a deal like that, they're in great shape. But I would not trade him for draft picks until the actual draft. I would wait until after the lottery when you know who has the first pick and the second pick and go from there and then trade Dubois at that point. But if he's really unhappy and they're going to get rid of him within the next month or so, I think you have to get a blue chip player that you can plug into your top six. They don't really need big defenders. They kind of need bottom four guys, but Werenski and Jones really have those top two, really solidify that top two defense pairing. And so I think if you were going to trade Dubois, you need at the very least a blue chip guy that you can plug into your top six forwards. But otherwise, it's a very solid team. They match up very well against the other teams in the division, and their goaltending is great. But I don't see them going anywhere further up than third, and that's because they're playing against teams like Carolina with that great defense core, and they've got some solid defense or some solid depth on with their forwards, with like Jordan Stahl and Jesper Fast. Andrei Svechnikov is a true star in this league now. Nino Niederreiter looks good. Hopefully he can, bounce back to sort of that Minnesota form. Maybe Ryan Dzingel can play like he did a couple years ago, but they just have such a solid team. I don't really have a whole lot of faith in their goaltending with Mrazek and Reimer long term. They put up great numbers last year, um, but they really didn't lose a whole lot. They brought in Vatanen at the deadline, but that's pretty much everything that they lost. Van Riemsdyk wasn't really a cornerstone piece for them, and their top six defensively, fantastic. Goaltending put up great numbers. You got some solid forwards with Aho and Svechnikov, Teravainen. So yeah, I think they'll definitely get at the very least top three in this division, probably top two. And winning the Central Division, I think the obvious pick is Tampa, even though they traded away Paquette and they lost Shattenkirk and a few others, and Kucherov's out with an injury. I think Stamkos just plugs into that top line winger role where Kucherov was. They've got great depth with Maroon and Yanni Gord, Blake Coleman. Um, it's a very solid team. They had Chernak and McDonough on the lower lines, so I think they'll easily win this division. As you can see, 2 years ago, Tampa blew it out of the water against teams in this division, but they did that with everybody and then kind of fell off this last year. But just everything about this team is fantastic. I would be shocked if they didn't get first or at the very least top two. I think Carolina is the only team that can really compete with them for that top spot. And one-on-one, Columbus was, solid against them. But it's a great team. I would be shocked if they didn't win. All right, moving on to the West. I should probably show this a little bit more if you want to write down these stats or check them out. But if we so in last place for the West, these these line projections are a little bit old. I took these screenshots 3 or 4 days ago, but it took a while to put these slides together, so I didn't have time to go back through and uh, snap all those pictures again. But it's close enough. I really like the addition of Shattenkirk. He can really kind of help groom some of their defensemen. Their top four is actually pretty solid defensively. Getzlaf is really falling off. Um, you know, they've got some solid players, but they don't really have any stars. I think Zagras and maybe Drysdale coming up, maybe they'll have that sort of rookie presence that will kind of help them turn the corner with their rebuild. But I don't really have a whole lot of faith in their ability to really compete in this division. John Gibson is kind of their saving grace here. He's just an elite goaltender. So, yeah, that's basically it for them. San Jose, a lot of people have said, they can bounce back. Last year was just ugly. There's no other way to put it. As you can see, 2018, 2019, they had by far the best record out of these 8 teams in the division. And then this last year, they were by far last place. So, they're kind of right in the middle with the average points and stuff. But yeah, I think bringing in Dubnik was a good idea because maybe he can bounce back. He was great like 2 years ago. Eric Carlson is supposedly healthy now, which will be great for them. I think Donato has some nice potential. We'll have to see how the Evander Kane situation plays out, whether or not he'll be playing this season, or if they have to void his contract. Hopefully, Kevin LeBanc can bounce back, but I think they won't be able to make it to the playoffs. They lost a lot of leadership by losing Joe Thornton, and their players aren't what they once were. They have a lot of big aging, bloated contracts that'll just really tear at them. Like, Burns, Carlson, Vlasic, they're still good players, but it's a lot of money. And Couture, they're not young either. They're all in their 30s. So I don't know. I would love to see them back in the playoffs, but I don't have a whole lot of optimism for them. They'll definitely be better than last season, but not much better. And the West is a good division this year, so we'll see how that goes. At number 6 or sixth place in the division, I have Minnesota. My big thing here is that they lost all their center depth. They don't have Koivu, Cunnin, Galchenyuk. We don't know when Zuccarello will be back. Kaprizov looks great. He should be a solid addition to the team. Parise, very underrated. Everybody kind of undervalues him just because of his bloated contract, but he's a very solid player. Fiala was fantastic last season. Johansson is great when he plays on the wing, so hopefully he can bounce back. But I just don't think having Bukestad, Bonino as your top two centers really going to, you're not going to succeed with that. I really like their top four defensively, but we'll have to see if they trade away Dumba before the expansion draft. And I think Cam Talbot is an upgrade over Devin Dubnyk. So they've made some upgrades, but is it enough to get them into the playoffs? Maybe in that fourth spot, but I don't see them doing a whole lot more. I think they'll be 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that range. I think San Jose and Anaheim really own those bottom two places. And then Minnesota is kind of in the middle of the pack. We'll see if they get hot or if they just continue to be mediocre. But that may be what they need, having some high level draft picks or some draft picks that maybe they win the lottery or something and get lucky and really start building up their center depth and their forward core moving forward. All right, so let's look at fifth place. I have Arizona. Arizona has played pretty well against the other teams in this division over the last 2 years. My big concern here is losing, they lost Hall and they didn't really play better with Hall in their lineup. So I don't think losing him is a huge deal, but losing Soderberg and Stefan and Hinestroza will cost them a lot too. They didn't really add a whole lot over the offseason. They've got great goaltending. Again, Ranta Kemper is one of the best goaltending tandems in the league. I really like Chikrin and OEL on defense and Clayton Keller. Phil Kessel can maybe have a bounce back season, but also Barrett Hayton really starting to solidify himself as an NHL player. So there's a lot to watch here, but I think they lost a lot over the offseason and they didn't bring in enough to really, solidify themselves as a playoff team. They barely made it into the playoffs this last year anyways. So that's why I have them at fifth, but they could be sixth, they could be fourth, kind of the same thing with Minnesota, but they are slightly better than Minnesota because they have Dvorak, Hayton, Schmaltz, and those guys down the center position. So that's why I have them at fifth over Minnesota. Fourth, I have Los Angeles. I really like they have a bunch of young players like Iafallo and also Byfield should be making it into the lineup. Velarde looks good. But they still have sort of that veteran presence with Doughty, Kopitar, Carter, the guys that were there during the Stanley Cup runs. That defense is really weak besides Doughty. but it's hard to kind of root against that leadership with all those young players coming up. Anthony could also bounce back. He put up 30 goals in Detroit not too long ago. He's only one season removed from that. Jonathan Quick is good. They still have Dustin Brown, so there's promise there. And if you look at the standings last season against the other teams in this division, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all very, very close. Anything could happen here. So I have them sneaking into the playoffs with the fourth spot in the West Division. Number 3, I have Vegas. If you look at those charts again, Vegas has not done well against the other teams in this division, but I think there's just too much star power for them to have anything worse than third or fourth, probably third. I think losing Schmidt and Stastny will really hurt them. But it gives space for guys like Cody Glass to come up, and they added Alex Pietrangelo, so that kind of helps them on defense. Pietrangelo, Theodore, that's solid defense, and also I think they have the best goaltending tandem in the league with Marc-Andre Fleury and Robin Lehner. So they just named Mark Stone as captain this morning, and they have Max Pacioretty. So they've got some solid players, but kind of like San Jose, they've signed all these big contracts, and they haven't played well against the other teams in the division. I could easily see Vegas falling off the cliff in like a year or two. Because those contracts are just not going to age well, especially like the Pietrangelo deal. That deal takes him until he's 37, and I think he's earning about $9 million with that. So it's not going to be pretty. But for now, they have some really solid players, and I can't see them finishing outside of the playoffs just based off of the talent that they have. All right. Number 2, I have St. Louis. They have a great defensive core. Their offense still has great players like O'Reilly and Schwartz. I really like how they brought in Hoffman to replace Tarasenko, who's going to be out this season. And they brought in Krug to replace Pietrangelo. I thought those were both great moves. Binnington really did not look good against Vancouver. It seems like some of the NHL teams kind of have a book on him. So that was one of the big reasons why I have them in second and not first, even though they've had the best record against the other teams in the division by far last year, by 16 whole points. But I think having that veteran leadership and that they have, and the star players, and also having young guys like Jordan Kyrou and Sammy Blais will really help them. And they also added some grit with Kyle Clifford. So I think they'll be a very solid team. My only question is goaltending, because Binnington, it looks like some other teams have a book on him, and he might fall off. He may be just a 1 or 2 season wonder. And their backup goaltending, we'll see how Husso does in the NHL. But it's a great team overall, and I can't see them finishing any worse than second. But they also have a solid shot at first place too. All right, Colorado. I see them as Stanley Cup contenders. That defense, probably the best top 6 defensively out of all the teams in the league. They didn't really lose anybody major over the offseason. It would have been nice if they had brought back Nemestikov. Kind of like what I was saying with Detroit. He can play up and down the lineup with injuries, but they've got some solid players in their bottom 6 forwards. Tyson Jost could still be on his way up. Nichushkin looked pretty good, especially considering how he played in Dallas. I think adding Brandon Saad will really help them offensively. And also that top line is lethal. And having Landeskog there and Kadri too, it's a great team. Kind of similar to Carolina. I don't know about Grubauer and Franzos as like long-term starters, but they put up good numbers and it should be fine. Um, but it's kind of hard to mess up with you know a great team in front of you like that. And between 2018, 2019, and 2019, 2020, they had a huge jump against the other teams in the division. And as these young players continue to grow, I really think they can solidify one of those top two spots. All right, so with that, we'll move into the Canadian division. Wait for a second so you can look at the stats there against how the teams line up against each other. All right, so in last place, I have Ottawa. I honestly really thought that I might put Ottawa at sixth or maybe even fifth. They added, because these Canadian teams are all so close to each other, anything could happen. Like any combination of the seven could happen. But Ottawa made some great additions over the offseason with Dadonov and Stefan and Galchenyuk. Stutzla is going to be a monster in the NHL. He looked great during World Juniors. Matt Murray gives them a true starting goaltender, but he only put up an 899 save percentage with with Pittsburgh last year. So we'll see how he plays in front of that Ottawa team. You'd imagine it would go down because Ottawa just isn't the same team that Pittsburgh is. But I really like the young stars coming in with Stutzla and Brandstrom and guys like that. Not to mention they still have Kachuk and Shabbat. So they'll definitely be a really fun team to watch. I'll definitely be watching them whenever I can. But basically, they're making their way up, but they don't have enough to really make a push for the playoffs just yet. They could sneak into that fourth spot. It would not be super surprising to me, but I really wouldn't bet on it. Right, at sixth, we have Vancouver. The only reason there are two reasons why I had them at sixth. They're a great team. I was really rooting for them in the playoffs, but if you look at how they've played against the other teams in the division, they are way behind everyone else, even Ottawa. So I don't really have a whole lot of confidence with them in this Canadian division. I like how they added Schmidt and Hamonic. I think those are great defensive partners for Hughes and Edler. Pedersen, Miller, Besser, Horvat, great players on offense. But that fourth line kind of worries me. I really like kind of the grit that they have with Virtanen and Roussel, guys like that. But I don't know that it's enough. The other thing that kind of concerns me, Holtby and Demko. Holtby kind of fell off last year. Hopefully he bounces back to his Stanley Cup form, but we'll see if that happens. He is getting a little bit older. And Demko, we'll see if we get playoff Demko, who is standing on his head against Vegas, or if we get the Demko that was in the regular season where he was good, but just kind of good enough. I also think they'll get Podkolzin back whenever he's finished in the KHL this season. So that'll help them at the very end of the season. But again, I could see them at any position in this division. I think anywhere third through seventh would be a good place for Vancouver. But I just think they lost so much, especially with Markstrom and Toffoli and Tanev. Not to mention the defense with Stetcher, and also Levo is a great player too. So they didn't really have the cap space to really make up for those losses besides Holtby and Schmidt, Hamonic. So we'll see how they end up doing. With Winnipeg, they brought back Stastny, which I really liked because they can roll a very solid top six with their forwards. Um, we'll see how the line A rumors go this year. They're always returning, but having that top six that worked so well against other teams, like especially in the playoffs in the end of that season, I think it was 2 years ago, but they were just on fire when they had Stastny. So hopefully he can return to that level. And if they have that chemistry, they'll be right there in line for the playoffs. They could finish anywhere in this division. If you look 2 years ago, they had 87 points, by far the best team out of these 7 teams. And then last year they had 44 points. They would have had 44 points with the schedule. So, kind of like that San Jose drop from first to worst. So we'll see how it goes. I think Hellebuck is great. And they've got some solid pieces here: Pionk, Morrissey, Scheifele, Line, Connor, Ehlers, Stastny, Wheeler. There's a lot there, but I don't know if they're like a solidified playoff team. So that's why I have them just missing the playoffs. But yeah, I could easily see them making it too. All right, in fourth place, I have Edmonton. Neil will be coming back soon. Clefbaum will unfortunately be out for the season. So that really hurts their defense. Kind of like what I was saying with Carolina and a couple other teams, Koskinen and Smith. It's good enough. It's a good enough tandem, but it's not that I don't see them winning the Stanley Cup with that tandem either. I really like the addition of Barry. That helps them with their defense core, but he's more an offensive guy too. And if he's anything like he was with Colorado, I think they're in good shape, especially on that contract. The one thing that I really like with them was signing Turris and having him on the third line. That allows them to move Ryan Nugent Hopkins up to the first or the second line, wherever they want to put him there. And having McDavid, Draisaitl, Nugent Hopkins in that top six, fantastic. They have Cassian, who will really help them with the grit, because there's going to be more fighting this year, inevitably, with playing the same opponent 9 or 10 times in this Canadian division. And getting Puljujarvi back will help them. Hopefully he's improved, with the American style of game, the North American style of game. He was great in Finland last year, so we'll see how that goes. I also like adding Dominic Cahoon, great player, underrated. So, it should be interesting. I don't think they'll be setting the world on fire and getting first place, but I don't think they'll miss the playoffs either. They'll be somewhere between third and fifth. That's just how I see it. But, guys could fall off, especially with defense and goaltending. So we'll see what happens. But they didn't really lose anybody major over the offseason either, which really helped them. At third, I have Calgary. I could see them anywhere in the top 3. I really like their center depth. And also they've got some solid grit with guys like Lucic really coming back into his own. He was kind of irrelevant when he was in Edmonton, but he's back to being a solid player. He's not putting up tons of points, but he adds that physicality to the team, which will really help them. Like I said, with the increase in fighting that will probably happen this season. Also adding Chris Tanev, great add-on defense. And Markstrom is exponentially better than Cam Talbot. Cam Talbot's solid, but that Markstrom-Riddick duo will really, really put them over the edge, I think. And Josh Levo is also an underrated add. And it also kind of helps them when they're playing against Vancouver, having all those guys who played over there, kind of in the same way that I was talking about Schultz with the Capitals. So I could see them finishing anywhere in the top 3. Toronto, I think this is the year they just, compared to any other team in the Canadian division, besides maybe Edmonton, Um, Toronto just has the most star power with Matthews, Marner, Tavares, Nylander, and we know the rest. Um, I really like how they added TJ Brody so that Morgan Riley really has a solid defensive and partner for the first time in years. Joe Thornton, I think he kind of fills that Patrick Marleau void, which explains why he's on the same line with Marner and Matthews. VC apparently looked good in camp, and having that physicality with Bogosian and Simmons and a few others, as opposed to just solely relying on Kyle Clifford, I think will really help them. So it's not as pretty as last year, but it's a much more well-rounded team. And I also think they'll benefit from having Campbell for the whole season and not just part of the season. They'll have a solid backup for the first time in a while so that they're not just draining Anderson. And I think that will help them in the playoffs because, as you can see, Anderson played 52 games and they only played, I think, 70 games this last season. So 52 out of 70, like that'll definitely put some wear and tear on you. That even though that, and let's pretend we didn't have that huge gap between the bubble and the regular season, but you know, there's a reason why they keep losing in the first round. It's because they keep throwing all their eggs in one basket with Anderson, and he just gets tired. If you play him like 65 games this season, he's just going to be burnt out by the time you get to the playoffs. But I really think their stars will carry them forward this year. And I think this is the year where they can really make some noise in the playoffs too by having that backup goaltender. All right, and in first place, I have Montreal. They matched up very well against the other teams in the division. I think they lost that Domi trade for Anderson, but they don't really have any huge holes on offense or defense, or the forwards and their defensemen. I like their center depth with Dano, Suzuki, Kakanyemi. Hopefully, we get Kakanyemi the way he was in his rookie year and not the way he was last year. Armia's underrated. Toffoli's a great addition to this team. We'll see how Anderson goes. They seem to like him based off of the contract they gave him, but we'll see how that goes. Tatar, Druin, back in the center. It's very solid. The defense is pretty good. But the big thing here is they'll have Carey Price and Jake Allen. As you can see, Carey Price played 58 games last year. Anderson only played 52. So that's just insane amount of wear and tear on him. And having Allen, probably the best backup in the league besides maybe Ranta or Halak, it's just phenomenal. And especially this year, I've said it before, you'll need two solid goalies to really carry you through the season. And they matched up well beforehand, and they're vastly improved over last season and 2 seasons ago. So I really think they'll play well against the other Canadian teams. So that's why I have them at first. Okay, so this is the overview of the standings that I just went through. Now, if we're moving on into the playoffs, I have, these are just sort of how I'll go division by division because they're going to have each division have their top 4 teams make the playoffs, and then have each division send a semifinalist, and then they'll sort it out from there. So in the East Division playoffs, we have Rangers Flyers. I think the Rangers will win just because the rookies like Lafreniere, Miller will really be able to get into a groove by the time they get to the playoffs. And the Flyers have an older core that may be kind of worn down. So, that speed that those younger players bring will be great for the Rangers. Now, between the Bruins and the Capitals, I think the Bruins will win. Rask will be well rested for the playoffs. whereas Samsonov really has to carry the load um, in net since it's just him and Anderson. Um, so I really see Boston as a stronger team down the stretch, even though they'll be missing Pasternak for a month or two in the beginning of the season. Um, so yeah, so into the second round, I see Boston winning for similar reasons, just that goaltending tandem will really leave them well rested and they just have all that playoff experience, whereas the Rangers players just don't really have that playoff edge to them. Boston just made the final 2 years ago, so I see them winning against the Rangers in this situation. Okay, so in the Central Division playoffs, we have Tampa Bay and Nashville facing off. I think Tampa Bay wins. They just have so many more star players. They have better goaltending and more depth, just well-rounded depth that Nashville kind of lacks. Defensively, they're kind of even, maybe even giving the edge to the Lightning. So yeah, I just see Tampa as a better team. Similarly, I think Carolina wins. They've got stars like Aho, whereas Columbus kind of relies on Dubois, who might not even be there by the time the playoffs come around. Columbus has that great defensive line with Werenski and Jones, but it kind of falls off after that. Whereas with Carolina, their entire 6-man defense core is just fantastic. So that's why, oops. All right, come on. So that's why I see them moving on. And then between these two teams, I see Tampa Bay winning. Just Tampa Bay has much more offense, and I don't really trust Mrazek and Reimer going super deep into the playoffs, especially when you have to go up against guys like Kucherov, who will be back in time for the playoffs, and Stamkos and Point, who was just incredible in the playoffs this last year. So we'll see how that goes. But I really see Tampa walking away and ending up in the semifinals, coming out of the Central Division. All right. With the West Division, I see Colorado kind of blowing out Los Angeles. I think Los Angeles has just enough to really make a playoff push, but not enough to really carry them through or really deep into the playoffs. I think they're kind of just barely making it, and that's it. And then between St. Louis and Vegas, Vegas just seems to have lost their identity. They kind of got too big too fast and then brought in a bunch of players like Pacioretty, Pietrangelo, and it just kind of threw everything off. And I think losing Schmidt will really kind of, they're no longer just the misfits. They're just a team, but they don't have the same identity that they used to. And, you know, I think St. Louis will ultimately win, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe Vegas were to take that just based off of the goaltending, because we don't know about Binnington and Husso combination. And for, as I just said, for that reason, you know, I trust Colorado a lot more to win this division in the playoffs. They just have more star power, but I think St. Louis has more depth, so that one really could go either way. But I see Colorado winning just mostly based off of that defense score that that Colorado will carry into that game. All right, and in the Canadian division playoffs, we have the Canadiens and the Oilers. I think the Canadiens will end up winning just because of that Allen Price tandem. We saw Price was phenomenal in the playoffs against Pittsburgh this year, and the Oilers just don't really have that with Koskinen and Smith. But you never know with that McDavid and Draisaitl and Nugent Hopkins. You know, they could, Edmonton could very easily make some noise, but they're losing Clefbaum will really hurt them defensively, and I think this will kind of be the last outing for them. So I see Montreal winning here. And I also see Toronto moving on because I think Toronto is younger. They'll have more grit this year, so they'll be able to compete with guys like Lucic and the grit that Calgary has. I think Calgary has more stars defensively, but that Toronto offense is just phenomenal. And I really think this would be a fun series to watch because Markstrom versus Anderson would just be great. But I see Toronto's offense just overpowering Calgary's aging defense. And I think Toronto has the grit to sort of match Calgary's or at least come close because that's really what has held them back these last few years, I think. And I see Toronto beating Montreal for similar reasons. Montreal has a bunch of young players, and they don't have the center depth or the stars that Toronto does. And I think they kind of lost a lot of grit too by waiving Corey Perry, who really carried the Stars to the playoffs this last year. And yeah, I see Toronto moving on just because, Tavares, Matthews, Kerfoot, that's it's great in terms of center depth. Whereas Montreal really has to rely on Danault and Kakanyemi and Suzuki, who are all great players, but I really see Toronto kind of overpowering that. So these are the final four teams that I have moving into the semifinals. Now, I don't really know how they're planning on doing this, if that'll be by regular season win percentage or what, but basically I'll just go through an overview for each team and how I see it happening. I don't know how they would decide who plays who in the semifinal, but for my least likely to win the Stanley Cup out of these four, I have Toronto. They just don't seem to be a great playoff team. I think they have enough to make it through the Canadian division, but not enough to really win the Stanley Cup. And Jumbo Joe and Wayne Simmons are really the only players on their roster who have experienced a lengthy playoff run. And I think, and neither of them have even won a cup. So I don't know. Yeah, I just don't feel like that's enough to get them to the Stanley Cup. Also, being the only Canadian team, if the border stays closed, they're going to have a much more difficult time trying to add guys at the deadline compared to the American teams like Boston, Tampa, and Colorado. So they won't be able to plug holes in the same way those other teams would. But I think they have enough to make a run in the playoffs, but I don't know if they have enough to win the cup. My second least likely out of these four to win the cup would be Boston. Big question is, will Pasternak be back to 100% after he comes back from his injury? I think this is sort of their last chance with their current core, although it feels like we say that every year. Just Bergeron, Marchand, the guys that are just getting older. Krejci, not to mention Rask and Halak. I think this is probably going to be Rask, the last season for him. And they're also just a great playoff team, but they never seem to be able to get over the hump once they get into the final. We saw they lost to St. Louis and Chicago over the last decade. So I don't know. That's why I have them as the second least likely. Now, my second most likely, I have Tampa Bay. They're a very well-rounded team. I think Tampa and Colorado are the two best teams in the league this year. But the big question is kind of similar to Boston. Will Kucherov be 100% once he gets back? And also, I think they might need to move somebody for cap reasons at some point during the season. Because I'm not sure how they did that with Kucherov going on long-term injured reserve for the season, because they were a little bit over and now they're right at $0 in cap room. But when Kucherov gets back, that's another 9 million added to the cap. So they're going to have to move somebody probably during the season. And the other reason I have them at second is just very difficult to repeat. But if somebody were to do it, I would not be surprised if it was Tampa. Now, most likely to win the cup I have is Colorado. They just have a great defense, a lethal first forward line, and it just feels like it's the year. They have some solid grit, some great depth, and just yeah, I see them having enough to really make a push. I still see Tampa as the better team, head on head, but or head to head. Sorry, but they, I don't know. It's very difficult for a team like Tampa to repeat just because they won last year, so the motivation isn't there. They're not under as much pressure to win. So that's why I would put Colorado as most likely to win, but it could be any one of these four. They're all great teams. So yeah, these are my predictions for this season.